everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm David Robinson. I'm the LSA's Director of Membership and Meetings. And we're going to wait just a couple of more minutes to allow a few more people to sign in, and then we'll get started. So sit tight, and we'll get going in just a few minutes. Thanks. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started now. Again, welcome, and thanks for being here, and welcome to the Linguistic Society of America's webinar on the National Science Foundation's Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grants, or DDRIGs. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Again, I'm David Robinson, the LSA's Director of Membership and Meetings, and you'll see a little more information about the LSA and what we do on your screens while I'm talking. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to go over a few technical details. You will see a GoToWebinar dashboard. It's probably on the right side of your screen with any controls that you will need to use. So among these controls are an audio widget, and that will give you instructions for calling in by phone if you're not using your computer's audio. You will also see a questions widget. You will notice probably that your microphones are silenced, so this questions widget is how you will ask your questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. And finally, there's a handouts widget. You'll see that we have a couple of handouts that are of the speaker's presentations, and you can download those at any time during the webinar. And before we get started, I'd like to take a quick poll of the audience to give our speakers a little better idea of who the attendees are. I'm going to start that poll now, and I'll just keep it open for about a minute. You'll see it's only one question, so it won't take too much time to answer. And we'll just wait a little bit until almost everybody has responded, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, I see everybody has voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and now you can see the results. 82% of you are current doctoral students. Another 8% are future doctoral students, and 8% of you are dissertation advisors. So I think we're just about ready to begin then. I would like to thank our speakers who have taken the time to be here today. Colleen Fitzgerald is the Program Director for Documenting Endangered Languages, a joint funding initiative between the NSF and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She is on rotation from the University of Texas at Arlington, where she is Professor of Linguistics and directs the Native American Languages Lab. Our other panelists are Jeff Good, an Associate Professor of Linguistics at the University at Buffalo, and Megan Figueroa, a doctoral candidate in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona. And Jeff and Megan are respectively a dissertation advisor and a doctoral student on successful DDRIG grant applications. This webinar will begin with a presentation from Colleen Fitzgerald about the DDRIGs and how to apply for one. After this part of the webinar is finished, Jeff Good and Megan Figueroa will speak briefly about their experiences applying for grants, and the last part of the webinar will be devoted to question and answer. As a reminder, you'll submit your questions using the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and if your question is for a specific panelist, please state that. And now, without further ado, I am going to turn the floor over to Colleen Fitzgerald. Take it away, Colleen.
Okay, can you see my screen? I'm going to assume that you can. So welcome, I'm Colleen Fitzgerald. I'm the program director, as David mentioned, for NSF's Documenting Endangered Languages program. I am also involved in other initiatives and have been on different panels, sat in on different panels and done co-review. So I've seen a lot of different things at the foundation. Oops, this way. So to give you a sense of NSF, it was created after World War II with 4 years of quite a bit of debate and a number of different issues, which included social science. And in 1950, when the Act created NSF, it was referencing of the other sciences. And it took a while, but we did finally appear with social science funding at NSF. And that was in 1957 with 4 fields: economics, anthropology, sociology, and the history and philosophy of science. So today, our agency is $7.5 billion. We have competitive merit review of about 50,000 proposals a year, with 11,500 of those or so funded. We welcome proposals from all qualified scientists and engineers, encourage women, members of minority groups, and persons with disabilities to compete fully in all our programs. And we support graduate students through fellowships and dissertation improvement grants. And grad students are also often funded through faculty research projects. So to give you a sense, I'm going to talk about 3 different programs, and they're all within the Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, SBE. And there's actually a few other dissertation programs in SBE that might be of relevance, and I'll have a slide where I mention those. I'm in the Division of Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences, which also includes linguistics, cultural anthropology. We have 2 other divisions. One is the Division of Social and Economic Sciences, which is programs like law and social sciences and sociology. And we have the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. So frequently when you see statistics on representation of ethnic and racial groups or women at various degree levels, those are coming from NCSES. All right, so some, but not all, programs in SBE offer dissertation grants. And so linguistics has them, Documenting Endangered Languages, or DEL, that's our little nickname for my program, and cultural anthropology all have them. But we don't have them in developmental sciences or science of learning or perception, action, and cognition or cogneuro. And those are all areas where we have linguists working, so we might want there to be dissertation grants in those programs, but they're not. For example, something that's relevant to linguistics and bears on issues of development or neuroscience could come in through linguistics. Oops. So when you are interested in submitting a DDRIG, they come in through universities, and you will have to work with your research office, your sponsored research office, to do this. The student is the co-PI, so PI. NSF has many acronyms and abbreviations, and PI is principal investigator. So your dissertation advisor is the PI on this grant, and you are the co-PI. So you can't submit a dissertation grant without your dissertation advisor being involved. You should be, the student who is eligible would be enrolled at a U.S. institution, but you don't need to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident to submit a dissertation grant. And the funds can be used for research expenses like field research, travel, payments to subjects, specialized research equipment, and those kinds of things while you're conducting the actual research. All right, so I'm going to talk about the anatomy of a proposal. And I did a dissertation webinar just for my program about a year ago, and someone said, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. There's so many things that you have to do. And that is true. NSF grants involve a lot of different parts and a lot of different components. I'm going to give you a sense of those, but I'm going to try not to spend too much time on talking about those details. But it would be good for you to come away from this with the sense of there's a lot of work involved in this. So in order to set things up, you'll need to register in FastLane, and fastlane.nsf.gov is the portal through which you will submit your grant and put all the elements in before submission. And your research office can help you get set up in FastLane with NSF, get an ID. Your advisor will also need to do that if your advisor isn't already part of this. And once you're logged in, you will have a lot of different pieces. So you'll have the cover page where you select which program you're applying to, submitting to. You will have the project description, which is a 10-page component. You will have a project summary, which is a 1-page piece that should address the intellectual merit and the broader impacts. References, a biographical sketch, and that will be for you, your advisor, and sometimes students have more than one advisor as on the grant, and so they might have the PI and the co-PI if they have people who are co-directing the grant, and all of you would need to have a bio sketch. The budget and the budget justification, current and pending support, facilities and other resources, supplementary documents, including a data management plan and the advisor letter template, collaborators and affiliations, which is a template you've got to fill out. So you're putting all these things in there, and then you're going to give the research office access to what you've done because they're the ones who hit submit and sign off on things. And frequently there's on-campus things that you have to do as well for routing. The research office will also help you with the budget to calculate what's called the indirect costs. You need to worry about what the direct costs are of the actual research. That's where the limits are on these grants, and so that's what you need to focus on. So a handy dandy graphic here on the process and the phases. So we usually tell people that the review process is anywhere from 4 to 6 months. Things come in and they're compliance checked. If you didn't put in certain forms, then and it's not compliant, it needs to be fixed before it can go out for review, or it could be returned without review. The review process could be in-house review. For dissertation grants, we do some combination of ad hoc reviews, so they get sent out to individuals who are just reviewing one or several proposals, or to advisory panels, which are people who are maybe reading a bunch of dissertation proposals and ranking them all and having a meeting. Once that whole review process is done and reviewers have made their evaluation of the work, the program officer recommends whether or not a proposal should be funded or declined. And then that goes to the division director, who then recommends, and then the final awards or declines are issued by Division of Grants and Agreements. And if you're funded, then the money would go to your institution. You would have an award letter, and you would deal with your university about obtaining access to those funds. It's always good to remember and keep in mind that it's really about 6 months to process a proposal. So if you are thinking that you want to do something and get funding within a month, that is an abrupt timeline that really wouldn't work in NSF funding strictures. So one of the words we talk about when we talk about NSF or grant opportunities is solicitation. And each of the programs in SBE that fund dissertation research has a solicitation, and it has specific requirements and general advice for submitting to that program. So you always want to read the solicitation. It's unfortunate when there's inquiries that come in that could be easily answered in the solicitation, but the person who sent the email didn't look at the solicitation first. So they're comprehensive, they've got a lot of detail in them, and it can be overwhelming, but always start by reading the solicitation. And that's a very specific document, but there's also what we call the PAPPG, the Proposal and Awards Processing Guide. I know it's PAPPG. I know I missed one of those P's. And that's like the almost like the Bible of what your grant should look like, what elements should be in there, eligibility, all sorts of things. And whenever there's a conflict between the two, you would go with a solicitation because it is more specific in areas or might overrule something that you're told that you don't include or can't include in the PAPG. And the big thing to think about when you're writing your dissertation proposal, so there's lots of small pieces of which are required and essential and are looked at, but the core project description is 10 pages and no more than 10 pages. So if you're going to submit these, I think I mentioned that the PI and the co-PI has to be there, and the student is the co-PI. These should be doctoral granting institutions in the US. And there is for the programs I'm going to talk about today, there is a 2 submission limit in the course of your graduate career. So you only get 2 chances to submit a dissertation grant, a DDRIG. Advisors can submit unlimited. An advisor can have several students who are submitting at the same time to the same solicitation. So this dissertation grant limit is only on the student themselves and how many times they can submit. So you want to think very carefully about the timing. All proposals that come in to NSF are reviewed according to official NSF review criteria in intellectual merit and broader impacts. The importance or significance of the topic, the qualifications of the team. If you're wanting to propose work in an area that you've got no coursework or publications in or presentations, the qualifications might be something that the reviewers express skepticism about. The creativity and originality of the project. Is it transformative? NSF is very interested in funding transformative science. Not everything is transformative, but if there's something that could really be revolutionary, that's something that reviewers would be excited about, as would NSF. The conception and organization and feasibility. What is the plan of work? Is the plan of work realistic? Does it anticipate delays, permissions, etc.? And for broader impacts, we're looking at the greater societal benefit. So training, for example, mentoring, diversity, infrastructure. Will this create some piece of infrastructure that will persist in the program, for example, after the student graduates? Dissemination and public awareness is also a broader impact. We see many scientists communicating their work in a public venue these days. You know, people writing, actually one of our panelists today, Jeff Good, it's a piece that he wrote on multilingualism in Africa in the conversation. That kind of writing is a broader impact. Societal benefits is the issue that you're looking at and researching, something that would shed light on educational challenges or poverty. So what kinds of societal benefits are accruing to the work? And I'm not sure I was going to keep in this slide on examples of broader impacts, but they're the kinds of things that might not be always totally attainable as a graduate student, but give you an idea about how you might think about your work. Is it enabling broader participation of women, persons with disabilities, or underrepresented minorities in the social sciences? Is it contributing to a globally competitive STEM workforce? If you're going to do international fieldwork, this would be one thing. Does it have an impact for STEM education and educator development at any level of the school system? Public scientific literacy, public engagement with science, well-being of individuals, economic competitiveness, national security, increased partnerships with industry. If you're doing a phonetics project that is going to have a really exciting connection with industry, that's a great broader impact. I always tell people to start with the budget. And this is especially true, I think, with a very large project, but it's also true with a small project like a dissertation grant, because you want to know if you can actually afford to do all the things that you would like to do in order to carry out the research. So DDRIGs don't provide the full cost of dissertation research. Each of the 3 programs I'm going to talk about has its own maximum for direct costs. The indirect costs are sort of the university tax, and it's a federally negotiated rate. We all determine our maximums on the direct costs, so you don't need to worry about that. That's the easiest thing to say for these. Is the project that's being proposed and the activities, are they consistent with the program or solicitation guidelines? And only include the costs that are directly related to the conducting of the research. So this might be costs for archiving, and those would go in the budget justification under other direct costs, line G6. Travel and related expenses to do research at field sites or archives or specialized collections or facilities at the student, away from campus. If you're working in a lab in Spain and that's justifiable because of the pool of subjects you'll have access to, then that would be something that you could argue for. Payments for research subjects or compensation for speakers of the target language, those are eligible. Supplies and services as needed. Sometimes someone is going to the field and needs a solar panel. Actually don't know how much those are, but if it's not going to put you over the cost and you can justify it, you make the case. So there's longer lists of these on each of the solicitation, and you can always ask the program officer. What don't we cover? Well, ineligible costs include any stipend or salary for the PhD student or the advisor. So now it may be you're having someone who is involved in the project who is neither the student nor the advisor, who you are paying, right? We mentioned, justifying the compensation for people involved. You can't cover top tuition costs, textbooks, or other items that don't have any direct relationship to the research that will be conducted. We won't cover publication costs for articles based on the dissertation unless that's built into university degree requirements somehow. And we won't cover costs for your advisor to travel to your field site or for your advisor to co-present this work at a professional meeting. This is really focused on the graduate student and their dissertation research. The data management plan is perhaps a fear-inspiring part of the proposal. As of 2011, all proposals must include a data management plan. It goes into other supplementary documents, and it can be a maximum of 2 pages. Through some other programs at NSF, we have been actually funding some different data management workshops. There was one at the Summer Institute, the LSA Summer Institute in Kentucky, and there was one at this past January Linguistic Society of America meeting. So we are definitely finding ways to help support these activities so you can learn more, but you are required to share your data within a reasonable length of time. And if there is no actual data collected, and that is justifiable and it's justified in a clear way, so this is sometimes the case for conferences, for example, then it could include the statement that no detailed plan is needed. I don't believe I've seen a dissertation proposal where there was no data being collected. But it's important to know that these are not one size fits all. What's the data that's collected? So you need to outline what kinds of data is collected. Recordings, what's the file format? Are there transcriptions? What's the format of those transcriptions? Reaction time. What will you be doing during data collection to manage and back up your data? What's your timetable for archiving? Metadata, what's your metadata plan? How are you going to give access? How are you preserving confidentiality or intellectual property or other rights or requirements? We are familiar with temporary embargoes, but the length of time must be specified and be reasonable. I had someone talking to me about a 20-year embargo, which would probably not go over well with reviewers. There is a checkbox on the cover sheet that relates to human subjects. So if you are working on your protocol at the time of submission, but you don't have it, you can check that box that it's pending. But if you're recommended for funding, your award will not go out the door unless you have a finding from your institutional review board at your institution. Now, it may be you're also required to get other approvals for the research that you're doing, like country approval for the site or a tribal approval. You should be keeping in mind that your IRB may not meet frequently over the summer or at all over the summer. But it's the campus, we expect the institution to do the work on the IRB, and that should be something that most of you are familiar with, I hope. All dissertation grants also need a signed statement from the advisor, and there's a template in the solicitation, but they're basically saying, you know, you will be able to undertake this award, these activities soon after an award is made, if it's funded, and that they've read the proposal and believe it's a strong case. All right, so those are the elements, and believe it or not, I actually really haven't gone into too much detail. Not that I'm trying to scare you, but there is a lot of stuff involved in those different pieces, and those were some of the key ones I think people have questions on. So let's look a little bit at the specific programs that might be of interest for people who are members, students who are members of the LSA. Culture anthropology has a significant dissertation proposal program. Their solicitation is publication 15-556, and on the slide you see I have a link there on what the address would be. The deadlines for their proposals are target dates of August 15th and January 15th. And because many cultural anthropologists are doing international field work for very long amounts of time, the proposal budgets have the highest of the three programs in terms of a maximum. So cultural anthropology budgets can be up to but not exceeding $20,000 in direct costs. And the maximum project duration is 24 months. And here are some of the issues mentioned, program priorities mentioned in their solicitation that would be relevant kinds of research. So sociocultural drivers of critical anthropogenic processes such as deforestation or desertification or urbanization, poverty, resilience and robustness of sociocultural systems, conflict, cooperation, and altruism, economy, culture, migration, and globalization. Now, obviously for the audience today, these would be issues as they may relate to language. So looking at language and variability in kinship and family norms, or cultural drivers of health outcomes and how that might relate to language. And some of these might not be as easily linked to linguistic anthropology. social regulation, governmentality, origins of complexity in sociocultural systems, language and culture, orality and literacy, sociolinguistics and cognition, human variation through empirically grounded ethnographic descriptions, and mathematical and computational models of sociocultural systems, social network analysis, GIS, etc. So linguistics is also its own solicitation for dissertation grants. The solicitation number is 14-551, Linguistics Program Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Awards, and the link is there. Their deadlines are July 15th and January 15th for target dates. So both the most recent deadlines for both cultural anthropology and linguistics have just passed. So if you would be interested in those programs, the next deadline would be in the summer. Linguistics has the lowest maximum. They have a $12,000 upper limit on direct costs and also a maximum project duration of 24 months. From their solicitation, I've pulled some questions that some of which are interdisciplinary or that may be of relevance to people on the webinar today. So what are the psychological processes involved in the production, perception, and comprehension of language? The computational properties of language or the language processor, which make fluent production, incremental comprehension, or rapid learning possible. How do the acoustic and physiological properties of speech inform our theories of language and or language processing? What role does human neurobiology play in shaping the various components of our linguistic capacities? How does language develop in children? What social and cultural factors underlie language variation and change? And so a lot of different kinds of projects. DEL, Documenting Endangered Languages, our solicitation is 16-617, and there's the link for that. And we don't receive as many proposals as the other programs, and we're really committed to receiving this. And we've gotten some feedback that our September, we had a once-a-year deadline, and having gotten some feedback about that being maybe a challenge for dissertation students recently back from the field, we now have an anytime deadline. So you could turn around and submit something on Friday next week and to the DEL program, and it would come in and we'd look at it and send it out for review if it was compliant. Our proposal budgets are a maximum of $15,000 for the direct costs, and obviously usually those projects are more expensive, but that's because of the indirect costs added by universities. So $15,000 in your actual research costs is what we're looking for. We are looking for proposals that are talking about the research question and the hypotheses. What's the data relevant to those questions? The theoretical framework and the methods of analysis. We expect a literature review and a work plan. We want to know what the specific grammatical features are that are really motivating this project that you're seeking to undertake. Are there typological properties or theoretical frameworks or genetic classification debates where the language you want to document is going to shed light on these kinds of debates? It's not enough to just say the language is endangered. We actually have specific criteria in our solicitation that we expect to be addressed in the proposal on the level of endangerment, the level of and quality of documentation. And so what your project should really do is try to articulate why this project should be funded over another one on a related language with the same number of speakers, because it's not just enough to say, well, there's only 10 speakers. And this may come up a little bit more on the senior proposals, but you know, we can't fund everything. And so you need to be able to articulate why this project, why now, how your project is going to advance knowledge relevant to linguistics, relevant to typology, etc. And we have a lot of elements because we're dealing with endangered languages. We're very attentive in our solicitation to things like having an investigator articulate what kind of consultation went on with the speech community, and also a lot of stuff with the DMP. So make sure you look at our solicitation. Now, many students do interdisciplinary projects, and there are some other programs I mentioned in SBE with dissertation grants, and actually one of these is not dissertations, was not SBE, sorry. So Science of Science Innovation and Policy, or SciSIP, has dissertation grants. So if you're looking at something maybe with language policy, that might be an appropriate program. Law and Social Sciences, Science, Technology, and Society also has dissertation grants. Arctic Social Sciences has dissertation grants, and if you were doing something on an endangered language in the Arctic, especially if it really had high cost of field work, that might be the program to submit to rather than Dell. If it's not an endangered language, obviously Arctic Social Sciences. Archaeology and biological anthropology, perhaps less related to the audience today. So you can do co-review, and what that means is a proposal is submitted to multiple programs. If that's the case, you would want to cite the literature on both and choose the programs on the cover page. So you would have a primary program, and it would need to come in on their deadline. So something that came into cultural anthropology, but might also have relevance for Dell, would ideally really probably want to come in for one of their target deadlines, and then check also on the box, my program, Dell. You can, if you're doing co-review, it can go to more than one review panel potentially. It could be that both programs decide to chip in money, or it could be that one program is really satisfied with the work that's being proposed and they're the only one that funds it. Maybe some programs have higher funding rates and there's better odds. But you also get reviews from multiple perspectives, and that can, really result in better science. So these interdisciplinary projects, we really are happiest when they're reviewing well from all the disciplines involved. So it's a picture of the NSF homepage, and some tips about where to look. You can search the NSF website, and you could just put in linguistics dissertation grant, and if you don't have the program links, that will come up for you. You can click on awards, and you can search for awards for particular programs, so you can see what the programs are funding, and you can click on funding and find the actual programs and get to the links from there. So all the programs have ways of accessing what's been funded by the program. It's really helpful to see what kinds of things have been funded. Some secrets to success. I'll just probably pull out a few of these so we can switch to the panel. But again, talk about the relevant literature and theoretical frameworks, and give a detailed plan on annotating or coding the data or experimental design, examples of transcription and analyzed data. Panels love pilot data. Reviewers love pilot data. So being able to have all those kinds of elements in your proposal can make it more competitive. And you must clearly address the intellectual merit and broader impacts that you expect your proposal will generate. Some pitfalls. Key aspects of the program announcement and requirements. So read carefully. I've had people email me about documenting endangered languages for languages with 10 million speakers. That's probably not going to be competitive. It's just not for my program. But there's linguistics and cultural anthropology, and maybe the project being proposed is suitable for them. Lacking specificity about really anything, methods, predictions, analysis plan. The type of research design that you have will condition the kinds of expectations your reviewers will have in terms of what they expect to see, so they can evaluate the likelihood of success. If the motivation or framing for the project is completely disconnected from the proposed activity, that's going to be a big problem. Or feasibility, if reviewers don't think that you can actually get the subject pool you're proposing, that's going to be a real problem. So think about what are the challenges for the research you're doing and have a plan for how you're going to ensure that those challenges don't make the work not feasible. Submitting without feedback. You have a dissertation advisor, you have colleagues in your grad program, you have other faculty. Getting feedback is going to make it a stronger, and incorporating that and revising will make it stronger. And the DMP is very, very essential. Again, people are scared sometimes of the DMP, aren't sure what to do, but it depends on what data you're collecting, and there's norms in each of those different communities. So many potential problems in things like burying your research question or assuming conclusions or tons of jargon, or it's why should we care? Why should we care about the problem that you want to work on? If you're proposing to do experimental work, but there's no evidence that you've been trained in the skills to design experiments and carry them out, that will be a problem. If it's unclear you'll be able to gain access to the field site, there's no letters, that's going to be a problem. And a really disorganized, unclear, not proofread proposal, something that looks like it's cobbled together from 5 different grant applications. Reviewers pick up on these things. So obviously jargon, try not to use words like interrogate or put into conversation with or scalar. Words like analyze, count, examine, explain, observe, those are more concrete and tell reviewers what you'll be doing. And this is a little bit of a slide provided by Cultural Anthropology, which the program officer shared, hackneyed citations that explain little, Foucault, the governmentality, and then just citing Foucault. Again, it would be like if you just mentioned generative grammar and then cited Chomsky, and there's so much more work and nuance that's been going on. You don't want to just cite the token citation everyone cites without really actually diving into whatever debate you're looking at. Beautiful proposals start off with a clear research problem and tie the project to that problem. They're not overly focused on that single case. They enable the researcher the reader to see you, imagine you in the field or in the lab carrying out that work. The research design is clear, it doesn't assume conclusions, and it tacks back to the question with a data analysis plan. So giving your reviewers confidence that the methods and the data analysis are set up and you're ready to hit the ground running. We also tell people to talk to a program director, get in touch early. If you email someone on January 14th for a grant that's due the next day, you might not even catch us in the office. So those are things to think about. But I always encourage people to read the solicitation before emailing, because those solicitations often have the questions that you're about to ask. I encourage you to look at the recently funded proposals, and it's usually easier to get an email rather than cold calling. It helps us know you've been forced to put things down in an email and articulate things, and you know that you're catching us at a time when we can address that or have special questions for what you're emailing us about. One-page descriptions of the project are often helpful, and asking for feedback. Does this project fit within the program priorities? If your proposal isn't funded, you can schedule a chat to talk with the program officer and determine whether revisions are appropriate or whether maybe the project itself is really not competitive in that program. To give you an idea of who the program officers are for these different programs, for cultural anthropology, Jeff Mance and Deborah Winslow are the program officers. For linguistics, Joan Mailing and Bill Badaker. And I'm the Documenting Endangered Language Program Officer. Our NSF website has lots of resources, and we're on social media, so those would be fun things for you to check out so you can see what's going on, not just in SBE, but in other sciences. So I think we're now moving to the next person.
Thanks very much, Colleen, and we're switching it over to Jeff Good. So Jeff, take it away. Oops, it looks, oh, there we go.
Sorry, I just had to click a bunch of buttons before it would let me on. Okay, let me try to get my screen going. And are you seeing my screen now?
No, we're not.
You did just a second ago. Yes.
Good, thank you. You see some slides. All right. I thought I would start just by saying something about the doctoral dissertation research improvement grants that I have been a part of as a co-PI. So there have been 2 that have had my name attached to them. The first that I listed here is research on Chant, which was a Miao Yao language, it was a grammar dissertation, and it funded fieldwork. The language happened not to be endangered. And as a result of that, the proposal was actually funded by linguistics, although I think it's more common for proposals of this kind these days to be on endangered languages and to go through Dell. And that resulted in a very nice grammar of that language. The second DDRIG that I was a part of was listed there as well, Linguistic Avoidance and Social Relations, and that was co-funded with Linguistics and Cultural Anthropology. It focused on the Toga language of Tanzania. And that also was not an endangered language. It might be a little endangered, but it made more sense to submit that to linguistics. And because there was a heavy cultural component to the research, it was also funded by cultural anthropology. It was looking at an in-law avoidance register where women had to have to avoid the names of their in-laws or words that sound like those names. And so that integration of linguistics and culture allowed it to be co-funded. So that's a good example of a co-funded project there. I've also worked, just to give you some more background, informally with students at my own institution and other institutions on their proposals, given them feedback, including some funded by Documenting Endangered Languages. And I've been on a few NSF panels, and I'm currently on the Endangered Language Documentation Program, that's the ELDP panel. And my experience on those panels informs many of the things that I'll be saying here now. And what I thought I would just do is come up with something a little bit like a laundry list, hopefully we're on the next slide now, of advice that I give to students or feel like I've given to different people over the years about how to go about applying for an NSF grant, and especially a dissertation research improvement grant. I think Colleen has already said some of these, but some of them I think really do bear repeating. The first one sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised by how often it doesn't happen. And that's to read the directions. And so whether that means the solicitation or the grant program guidelines, it is worth looking at those carefully. One area where I see people make consistent mistakes is they assume that NSF semantics is compositional, and that is they look at these NSF terms and they think, well, intellectual merit. Well, I know what that means because I know what intellectual means and merit means, or broader impacts. Often I read broader impacts and people focus on how the research will have broader impacts outside of the discipline of linguistics, but in fact, broader impacts is more about impacts on society. So you really need to know what these terms mean and not assume that you can guess what they are. Similarly, even a data management plan, if you look in the instructions, there are, I forget precisely how many, maybe about 5 specific things that it asks you to cover in the directions. And it's worth saying, did I answer all of the questions that I'm supposed to answer, rather than just assuming that you can just kind of guess at what a data management plan means. A second piece of advice that I kind of give often and kind of emphasize is just to remember that the reviewers, especially panelists, but really any reviewers, I mean, these are all people who are doing this work for free. They have a lot of other obligations. They probably agreed to review your proposal when they thought they would have more time, and now suddenly it's due, and they have to get it finished quickly, and they're kind of regretting that. They're not regretting your research because it's probably very interesting or they want to read it, but suddenly they have to get this done. They're probably overworked, tired. For those of you in the audience who might be younger, aging eyes just do not read fine print the way young eyes do, and so you don't want to get too small with your fonts or too fine-grained if you don't have to. And it's very good to make the reviewer's task easy by having a clear proposal with sections, calling out the most critical things for review. And in particular, that means make it really obvious what the intellectual merit and the broader impacts are. Have dedicated sections to those. Make it really clear that they can find out what those particular things are and sort of pull those out. Now, if they really like your proposal, they might find points of intellectual merit that you didn't think of, and that's great, but you don't want to make them sort of guess at what the intellectual merit or broader impacts are. And especially if they're panelists, they're going to be reviewing about 20 or more proposals, 20, 30 proposals in the course of a few weeks, and they really value the sort of ease of finding those important points. Another point, and I think Colleen got at this broadly when she said that these NSF proposals are complicated and daunting. So I want to kind of emphasize that, and just to give a recommendation of how much time it will take, I would probably guess, come up with your most pessimistic assessment of how long you think it will take you to write, and then double it. And the reason why I say to double it is that at least the first time I wrote an NSF dissertation grant, or sorry, NSF proposal, and I think when most students write their dissertation grant proposals, they really focus on the narrative. That is the 10-page document that describes the core of their research. And that takes a fair amount of time to do right, but then you need about, especially the first time, you probably need about twice as much, like that amount of time doubled, right? Like the same amount of time to do all the extra things that you need. So learning how to use Fastlane. If you've never used Fastlane, you might have to fight with it a bit to get it to do what you need to do. You need to have your budget and your budget justification. That can take some time. Data management plan can take some time. BioSketch, and Colleen mentioned a lot of the other pieces there. I would say the non-narrative part takes about as much time in total as the narrative part, unless you're very experienced, and then you might be able to do some of those pieces a little faster. And then you also, depending on your institution, you'll always have to work with your sponsored projects office, and they have their own rules and requirements. I actually find I often have lost a lot of time just negotiating details of the budget with them, because in the end, they have to sign off on the budget, and we have to have a lot of back and forth. I might use a term like consultant, or the student might say they're working with a consultant. The sponsored projects office understands that to be a legal consultant for tax purposes, and then wants to know, the details of how they're going to be paid, and then what you really mean is someone in the field that you hand a few dollars to, and then they need to understand these things, and there's a lot of just sort of details, and that can just take a fair amount of coordination. So you need a long lead time to work with them, and you want to budget a lot of time to work with them. Okay. Then to get to some more points, Colleen got at this too, this idea, just to emphasize, it's really an application to do work. It's not, you have to have good science, you have to have a good theoretical framework, you have to have good methodology, but you also need to make clear that you can actually do some specific work that you're going to be given money for, right? And the way I like to think of this very often is, you're asking for money that kind of for free. You're saying, give me money to do this thing I really want to do. Why should you be trusted with it? And you show that by having a very clear, organized application that also makes very clear what you're going to do, that makes it clear what the money is being invested in, right? So that's just another piece in mind. It's a little different from writing a term paper or a qualifying paper where you're showing your skills as an analytical linguist. Here you're trying to show that, but also trying to show that you're a good kind of project manager. Colleen mentioned something, that there's a pitfall in a lot of applications, like if you're proposing to do experiments, but you have no experimental background, reviewers will notice those. If there's an obvious weakness of one kind or another, or the language doesn't seem to be endangered, reviewers will notice it. And what I usually advise is don't try to hide it. If you really think you need to do this project, acknowledge the weaknesses, and then just explain how you're going to get around them. So maybe your dissertation advisor does not really know about experimental design, but there's someone else in your department who does. And so you can get them to write a letter of commitment saying that they will advise you on that. An example like that. Or maybe you don't have the training you need at this moment, but you're planning to go to the LSA Summer Institute, and you'll take courses there to fill in gaps in your training. So acknowledge the weakness and then just have a plan to work around it. reviewers may still think you're too weak to do the research, but that's much better than asking them to fill in that gap, right? And making them speculate as to how you will get around what's an obvious weakness. Another point I just think that is go back through. Obviously, you need to proofread your application, go through it carefully, and make sure it's coherent. I'm actually surprised at how often I see applications where they say at one point they're going to do this kind of research, but then maybe you get to the work plan and it looks like they're doing something else. Sometimes I see documenting endangered languages grants, maybe where all of a sudden there's going to be maybe an informal sociolinguistic survey that's going to be done as part of the grammatical, alongside a grammatical analysis, but there was no discussion of that until the work plan. And you're kind of a reviewer, then you're wondering, well, where did this project come from? How will it be successful? And you want to think, have they really thought it through, or were they cobbling together pieces from something else? Which does happen more than at least I would expect. Another thing, this is point 7 now, sometimes I get through a whole dissertation research improvement grant and I don't see anything about the dissertation. You don't want to spend too much time on that. You really want to talk about the project, but I find it very helpful to know, okay, how does this research turn into a dissertation? What does the dissertation look like? How can we be reasonably sure that once they get this funding, the dissertation can be successfully finished? Will it be a good dissertation that will make NSF look very good, and like the student look very good, and the home institution look very good? So make it clear why this is the necessary research for your dissertation. In case you're rejected, I just think this sounds like kind of obvious advice, but it's not always followed. To make sure the revisions seriously takes all the criticisms into account. And then it's helpful, I find, to have people explicitly say, an earlier version was submitted, these were the problems that were noted, and this is how I addressed them. So that there's really a clear link between the reviewer's comments and what changed along the way. The reviewers could change, the panel could change, but then at least they understood that you responded to the revisions in good faith and seriously. Okay, and then getting to the last slide, this is especially the case, I think, if you are working on a resubmission of a rejected proposal, where I think it's very helpful to understand the review process. The details can be different from program to program. Presumably a program officer will be able to help you to know exactly what's true of their own programs. Some of the reviews may be ad hoc, right? They're just sent out to an expert. Please review this one proposal, send a review back to NSF. You should know, if you ever get a chance to review a proposal, I would say take it so you see the process from the inside. Reviewers will be asked to say, what are the intellectual merits of the project, right? What are the broader impacts? They have to answer those questions, so you want to make it easy for them to answer. Some reviewers will also reviews will come from panelists. These will appear in Fastlane. They will not necessarily, generally they don't look any different from the ad hoc reviews, but obviously they carry different weight because that was someone who was in the room really discussing the proposals carefully, probably someone with some more experience. And I do often advise people, if they're doing a revision, to see if they can kind of get a sense that maybe one review is from someone who really seems to be more experienced or more knowledgeable about the process, and maybe just note that and think about that as they're doing a revision. The panels do change, so there's no guarantee, of course, that just because you satisfy a panelist in one round that you'll get the same one in the next round, but you might, and so it's good to pay attention to that. But I think here, the point I have in 9D is also really important to bear in mind, that not all reviews are going to be treated equally. So if you're doing a resubmission, suppose you think, well, I had these 2 excellent reviews. Why was I rejected when these people said my research is great? And because they said my research is great, why should I revise it at all? Well, if you were rejected, probably those excellent ratings were not taken very seriously, for good or bad, and you probably should be paying attention to the more critical reviews. So just because you had good reviews doesn't mean you can kind of rest on that. And one thing that I've often seen as a panelist looking at the external reviews is that a lot of the excellent ratings are very supportive of the research, but they're just not very critical of the proposal. And so they often sort of judge the proposal as though, how great would the world be if the proposed research were successful, but they don't really get into the details of, is this a good work plan? Is this a good budget? And so one reason why those reviews aren't given the weighting is because they don't really seriously engage the particular proposal. And that's why you can't just assume that because you have some really high quality reviews that everything's in order. It does mean there's something really good there, but it doesn't mean that the whole package is there. So I would just be a little wary of not thinking critically about each of the reviews and what they're all trying to say. Those are my broad points. I'll be happy to take further questions when we're done with this, if people have any questions about what I've said here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Megan Figueroa. So, Megan, take it away.
Okay, here we go. So hopefully you can see PowerPoint and me.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm here basically to tell y'all that I got rejected the first time, so there is hope, and I learned a lot from that process, and hopefully it will be of use to y'all. So hold on a second. Okay, here we go. So my DDRIG is called Who Break the Rule? Rethinking English Past Tense Over Regularizations. And I just wanted to point out the intellectual merit and the broader impacts because as Colleen and Jeff said, these are very important. You don't want your reviewers to guess at what they are. So mine was advancing our understanding of the child acquisition of inflectional morphology and help us to develop more realistic milestones to measure children's progress in first language learning. And my broader impacts were further the involvement of women and underrepresented minorities in STEM-related research. Now, my intellectual merit and my broader impacts actually didn't change from my declined proposal to the one that was successful. What did change is how I presented it to the panel. Once I got a decline, after I read the reviews, my first instinct was kind of to be defensive because this is my dissertation work, and I was like, no, that's not true, you know. So I think the first thing to do is to step back, maybe have some ice cream, and then go back to it. And I realized that the reviews were actually very, very helpful, and all of them said that my big problem was that I spent too much time on the background and I didn't give enough information on the methods. And from that, some of the reviewers said that I had methodological issues. And so when I'm reading these reviews, I'm like, no, that's not a methodological issue because I'm doing X, Y, and Z. But the problem was that I didn't tell them about X, Y, or Z because I spent too much time on the background information. So my first piece of advice would definitely be to remember that the folks that are reading this do know the background. That's why they're given the proposals. At least they know enough that you don't have to tell them the whole story. So be very careful about what you say in the background so that you have enough room to really go into the details of the of your research. You want to approach it like, what are the types of questions someone might have about my research, and then answer those before they can even ask them. So spend a lot of time on the methods and make sure that you address concerns folks might have. So once I did that, I was able to resubmit, and in my resubmission, I said that in the decline, or in my previous proposal, reviewers said this, and this is how I will address it. So I specifically said that I am addressing it in this way. And when I got reviews back for the accepted proposal, there was actually someone who was on both panel, or who reviewed both of my submissions, and that person actually mentioned how pleased they were that I took the reviews seriously. So just remember, and like Jeff said, that there are people that are very tired and have lots of work that spend their time doing this. So it seemed that the reviewer was really appreciative that I actually listened to their reviews and implemented them. So that's the big thing that I would say about the proposal as far as the what you're going to do with your project. Colleen said it'd be good for me to talk about broader impacts. So I wrote a few things down. I made a mistake with my broader impacts because I thought that broader impacts meant that what I was doing, so working on inflectional morphology, had to be important to greater society. So what I now realize was kind of grasping at straws, is I said that it would help second language learners learn the English past tense rule. And the reviewers saw right through that. Several reviewers said, I don't see why there's any reason that there had to be like that this proposal had to have a broader impact that involved actual inflectional morphology. So I went into this assuming that I needed to make sure that what I was studying actually helped broader society, and that's not necessarily the case. Like endangered language proposals, of course, will have a very obvious broader impact when it comes to the work, but mine really doesn't. It has great intellectual merit, right? It's going to help us understand how children learn language, but the broader impact actually came in with me. So I am a first-generation student. I'm also Mexican American. So I explicitly said in my broader impact that having me as co-PI was going to further involvement of women and underrepresented minorities in STEM-related research. I also mentioned my research assistant who is helping me on this, who is Pakistani American, and she is also a woman. So both of us working on this project actually helps to further involvement of women and underrepresented minorities. And another thing that I did that the panel liked is that I said that I wanted money to take the undergrad RA with me to a conference so that she could be introduced to the world of conferences and scientific intellectual collaboration and all of that. So they really liked that. I got money for that. Another thing that they really liked, and I say this with caution, is that I said that I would advance public engagement with STEM-related research by doing public outreach with middle schoolers. And they really liked this, but they also really liked this because I have a background in volunteering with a specific group of middle schoolers that I still continue to do. So they mentioned that they liked it because there was documented, it was documented that I actually volunteer with this group. So I wouldn't just say something like, I'm going to do public outreach when there's no reason to think that you would be able to do that. So think about what you do outside of research, and maybe there's a way to pull that into a broader impact. Any other notes? Let's see. Okay, and then some little points at the end. Have a non-linguist read it. That might help you with your jargon. They will also bring up questions like, I see you did this, but then you never mention it again. So that's always helpful. Hopefully your advisor is someone that's really helpful. Me and my advisor worked on this together. Well, I wrote it and she was very, very helpful. And okay, so after you write it, you are not done. So the FastLane process is very time consuming. So after you have all the pieces together, you still need to give yourself plenty of time to put it up on FastLane. All right, so I think those are my big points. And
okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to open it up to question and answer. Sorry, were you finished, Megan?
Yes, I just wanted to say I'm sure people have more questions for me since I am the student and since there are so many doctoral students. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, great. So we'll open it up to Q&A now. Again, you'll see the questions widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard. So that's how you're going to ask questions. And if your question is specifically for Megan, Jeff, or Colleen, or any combination of them, please let me know. And so, let's go ahead and, all right, so let's see the question.
I'm just going to add, Megan, that was awesome. And I loved the, after you write it, you are not done.
It was a hard lesson. Yeah.
All right, so we have a question here. Is there any upper limitation on the number of proposals from one institution per year?
No.
Okay, that was easy.
Yeah.
All right, second question, maybe I missed it, but approximately what is the resubmission rate?
I don't know those numbers.
Okay, let's see. Here's a question.
I would add, I not only don't know those numbers, but it's not a number NSF would keep track of, because even if it's a resubmission, each proposal is treated as formally, it's treated as a new submission when it comes in. So you're not guaranteed it's going to go to any reviewers or panelists that had it before. And it may, I mean, I've had things come in that were resubmissions, and sometimes panelists are like, I don't want to read it again. I mean, that's probably more, I don't have dissertation panels, so, but some things come in like senior proposals, and, so you're restricted to the 2, but you can't make any assumptions that anyone will have read it before. And, if something came in, it could be even going to a new program officer that didn't manage it before. So the stats that NSF keeps is funded rates, numbers of proposals that are submitted, and how many of those are funded and not funded.
Okay, thanks. That question sort of segues into another one that we just got. So the person says, thank you for this great lecture. I have a question for all. Who reviews my proposal? I understand that there are ad hoc committees, but is there any way that I can know anything about their background? Psycholinguists, psychologists?
So, yeah, I mean, it really depends. And actually, each of the programs that I'm talking about today has a different set of ways they work things. So it could be that your proposal is totally read by ad hoc reviews. So they're all sent out to specialists and there's no panel. That's how the Dell reviews are working right now, because we don't have the volume of proposals that linguistics and cultural anthropology have. When program officers do ad hoc reviews, we look at the proposal. So I would bet that Megan's proposal went to someone doing acquisition of English, somebody doing, maybe inflectional morphology. Maybe the panel reviewer was a psycholinguist or a syntactician. Linguistics definitely has psycholinguists and psychologists and computational people involved. And cultural anthropology also has a range. So the cultural anthropology dissertation grants, will involve linguistic anthropologists, but also medical anthropologists and cultural anthropologists. And depending on how many proposals come in of that nature, it may be there's only, say, one linguistic anthropologist on the panel for cultural anthropology, and the other 2 people reading the proposal are not, are in other areas of anthropology. So you hope, people are going to look at the proposal, and depending on the volume of proposals, if it goes out for ad hoc, look at the references. That's one way program officers often think about who to send it out for specialized review. I don't know if you guys want to add stuff. I mean,
I'd say, isn't that also why it's important to not use jargon, to be careful to explain exactly what you're doing? And also, like I said, have a non-linguist read it. That was very helpful for me.
I think as someone who also has done some journal editing, it's really, and this is something where it might be easier to even ask your advisor who might know more about that than grant review. It's very similar where, you look at a paper and it's about this language family and it's using these methods. So you kind of want someone who knows the methods to review it, maybe someone else who knows the language family and these sorts of things. If it's I think Colleen can verify this, if it's a documenting endangered languages proposal, maybe there's someone who doesn't even know linguistics so well, but they know that part of the world, and you want them to do a reality check. Like, can you actually do field work here? Is that part open? Yeah. So it's kind of the sense of what's all the input that the program officer, maybe the panel needs to know that all the pieces of this are manageable. Is it good theory? Is it good methods? Is it practical for the location? All those kind of things. So it really,
yeah, and that's a great point. I could imagine on the cultural anthropology that maybe one of the reviewers is a specialist in that region of the world, even if not in the content, the subject content. I would add, you can always suggest reviewers. So there is a part, a spot in Fastlane where you can put a list of suggested reviewers. But it doesn't mean that they will be selected. And sometimes I find that people suggest reviewers that they're they have a conflict of interest with. So I've had things come in where someone suggests their dissertation, non-dissertation awards, like suggest their dissertation advisor to review it. And so that, I mean, that's just, so, but you certainly can suggest it. But I would say if you're doing a good job with your references and citation of the literature, you're making it easier for your proposal to be competitive and to be sent out to the right reviewers.
Okay, here's another related question. I don't know if you feel you've answered it already, but it says, can you talk a little bit more about how reviewers are picked?
I mean, again, references, what is the content of the project? Jeff mentioned some things in terms of what he looks at, he's looked at as a journal editor, and it's the same kinds of things as program officers. The more interdisciplinary a project is, the more it will be something that has a lot of different kinds of reviewers, which might also mean the ratings vary a lot. You know, you're going to look for language, you know, if you're doing a project on some language family in Central Asia and it's a syntactic documentation project, then it might be that there's some syntactic reviewers. There's people who are specialists in that language family, and you know, those, you know, what is the literature that you're citing? That's one of the ways. And then it's who agrees to review in the timeline. I send out email requests all the time, and people don't even email me back. You know, and then I would also say hopefully your dissertation advisor and the faculty in your program are reviewing for NSF, because, or maybe have been on panels, because that kind of expertise is also really helpful. But the better job you do on your references, the more likely it is, and that you aren't conflicted with those people, so you don't have a conflict of interest, the more likely the right people will be sent out.
Just to, one thing that Colleen, I think it's important to bear in mind, the who agrees to review is probably a much bigger filter than students probably realize until they're on the other side and asking for people, right, to review things. I don't know, don't reveal it, but that's a really big part of it, is just who says. I mean, you might think so-and-so has to have reviewed it because they're the real expert, but they may have just said no or not responded to the email. So that's a really,
you know, I mean, I saw this, gosh, I don't know who I saw this from, but I think I saw recently someone talking about, or someone was talking in another program, was talking about dissertation panels. And, you know, like dissertation panels, it's great. That's a great one to get really new junior faculty on, because they've got a lot of energy, and it's something that, you know, it's service to the profession, and it's maybe more meaningful to them. So it may also be that the people who are higher at your kind of the big names may not be the reviewers. It may be their students who have gone on and finished, or you know, people who are junior faculty. And so, and you know, sometimes those can be harder reviewers as well because they're more new. But you know, the value of having multiple reviews is that then it goes to the program officer. If it doesn't go to panel, so panel looks at all of that and puts it into a category. Is it highly competitive? Is it raw major revisions needed, or somewhere in between? And then the program officers make the funding recommendations. And in my case, I've been trying, because I don't have a panel, I've been trying to send it out to 4 reviewers for ad hoc, and to try to have one of those reviewers be someone who's really looking at the data management plan, because that's the kind of thing panel is always very aggressive on, and ad hocs aren't. And I had something else I was going to say, but now I forgot what it was.
Can I add that a little bit, just when you talk about the data management plan, just panels, and also this is also from my experience on the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, that it really is good to have that variation. Like the some people who are more experienced, I think, do focus more on the ancillary documents like the budget and the data management plan, and that's great. I mean, someone should be doing that. I think it's really hard if you just read your first grant proposal as a reviewer, you don't really pay as much attention to those because you haven't seen enough of them to really know what to do with them. For myself, I actually often jump to the budget justification first, or I read the project summary, jump to the budget justification, because that gives me a really good I always think of it as like a peacock's tail kind of thing. Like if that thing is in order, then I actually know that this person probably had put a lot of effort, because usually that's something that people do at the end, and data management plan. I like to jump to that. If it's a documenting endangered languages project, I'm always like, did they budget for enough microphones and hard drives? Because that separates people who really know what their field site needs are from those who are just guessing. So I just want to add that I found serving on panels too, I've learned a ton about what my fellow panelists bring of experience and how they ask a different set of questions than the ones you're trained on as a student. So that's a really interesting, I think the panel has its own dynamic, and I think it's really helpful and great. And it's good to understand that you've got people looking at 50 proposals at once against someone just looking at one proposal. And that's going to reveal different kinds of patterns there.
Yeah, I always tell people to do the budget first. Megan, how did you do the budget?
I did it first. Yeah. Someone had told me to do it first, and so I did it first. Yeah, because then you realize when you're writing it, if there's like no reason why you should have asked for X, Y, or Z, you're like, oh, well, I better add that.
Yeah. I actually start specific for NSF. I like to really start with the budget justification document, because that's like the readable version of the budget. And then I actually send that to my sponsored programs office, and they find that a really easy way for us to work. We actually iron out a lot of the kinks through that document, because I understand it and they understand it. And then they work on the strange NSF spreadsheet, which all of you who go through this process will eventually see, when it gets translated into a very fast lane friendly way. I think that must be a typical model. I don't think it's just Buffalo that does that.
And, Megan, I don't know if you, did you do any, so I know you're at University of Arizona, and a lot of universities have different small grant programs for PhD students to do their research. Did you do something like that? Which also can give you some experience writing budgets.
Yes, I got rejected, but I did do that before. Yeah, they were small. It was like a $2,000 one. It does give you experience doing budgets. Also, within the department, the account manager was actually very helpful too. So see who's in your department, that can be helpful.
Did you look at did you get to see anybody successful?
Yes, and then so you could, if you have some sort of like grad student listserv, which we do, I asked if anyone wanted to share. Of course, don't be offended if no one wants to share, right? But yeah, I did see someone else's successful DDRIG proposal.
Megan, I just love you telling everybody about this adversity, and because from my vantage point, I can see how much failure is behind every successful grant application. I forget what the number is. I think it's like, for people who are funded PIs, they've submitted usually 4 proposals before getting funded on average. And you don't necessarily get funded, but you've got to keep trying and use that feedback productively.
Yeah, don't forget that is important. Like I said, my reaction was kind of getting defensive because I was getting rejected, but I had to remember that maybe I wasn't explaining how important the work was, or I wasn't doing it well enough. So the critiques were actually very helpful because people couldn't see what I was saying.
I'll say, so I had those 2 DDRIGs that I mentioned at the beginning. One did get accepted the first time. The other one by Alice Mitchell, I think first she tried endangered language documentation program. They said the language wasn't endangered enough. Okay. Whether that's true or not, whatever, that was what they said. She tried Wenner-Gren, almost made it through, but not quite. Then went to NSF. I was very pleased personally. I think the reason why she could get co-funded from linguistics and anthropology, a lot of it was because she'd gotten feedback from an anthropology. Wenner-Gren is an anthropology program. That was critical. I don't think she would have made it through because, I mean, I'm a linguist. I don't know the nuances of how to get through the cultural anthropology panel. So that was great. And she mentioned that she thought, I asked her before this thing, I'm like, do you have any advice? She said, the rejection was very helpful. And it's normal. And I think I've been rejected plenty of times, and it's just part of the process. And you just have only the people who, no one gets funded without rejection, right? All the best funded people in the field have probably been rejected twice as often as they've been.
There's people who've never been funded.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. We've got some more questions coming, so we'll move on if we can. Here's one. Can funds be applied retroactively, such as if I already want to start testing participants before I know if I've been accepted?
Wait, I didn't hear that question.
Can funds be applied retroactively, such as if I already want to start testing participants, which I guess would be something you need funds for, before I know if I've been accepted?
You're applying for work that hasn't been done yet, so I don't know that you can do something like that. I do know if you have been recommended for funding, there is a 90 days clause that your university can start spending, but they're taking the risk that if the grant somehow doesn't get funded, that they will cover those funds. And that can be up to, I think, 90 days before the start date. But that's your university taking the risk after your program officer has said, yes, we're going to fund this. We're going to recommend, but that's the other thing, program officers recommend funding. But as I said, it's like several different stages before an award actually goes out through the door, and it's not the program officer who funds it. We just recommend.
Thanks. Here's a question for Colleen. How do you ensure the ethics of the review process? In other words, make sure one or all reviewers do not reject a proposal because of ideological/political conflicts.
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking there, but we try to send out to a wide pool of reviewers, and you know, we can't, depending on what your topic is, you might, I mean, the only way I can think you might be, what your question might be reflecting is like a formal functional divide, maybe, that that the project would go out to two completely contradictory kinds of reviewers. And, you know, I mean, that certainly may happen. And if it would happen, it might be for a different reason. So, you know, I don't know that, yeah, I mean, that's, I'm not really totally sure how to answer what's being asked. But I think all of us, we get a lot of training at NSF on the merit review process, and we take it really seriously. It is considered the gold standard worldwide for merit review. And, you know, there's always, we try, the collaborators and affiliations forum is one where people are expected to outline the people that they are conflicted with. Like your dissertation advisor's dissertation advisor will not read this proposal because that's a conflict of interest. You can put in, if there's people that you feel would not give a fair review, you can put those in. It doesn't mean it still won't go to them. What if that person's on panel or what have you? But you can certainly put that in, and people do that. But we do get a pool of a number of reviews, and so if it perchance went to someone who might have some ideological difference from what the proposal is articulating, presumably there would be some other reviewers, and you could see the whole kind of panoply of evaluations. I don't know if that's really answering the question that you're asking, but we take merit review incredibly seriously, and you know, we spend a lot, I mean, it takes up a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to try and find the people who you think are going to be the best reviewers. And there are people who are hard reviewers. There are people who are easy reviewers. You know, what we want is to be able to fund the very best science out there. And that is our mission at NSF. People have approached me and they're worried about ideological conflict usually. I mean, again, this is a case where I'd probably tell a student, well, don't totally ignore it. I mean, we know it's there. I often say, if you can find a way to structure your project that the most ideological portion is only a piece of it, but the other pieces would be good anyway. I don't know how you would do this for a psycholinguistics project. I don't have that expertise. But if it's documenting endangered languages, if you're making good recordings and annotating naturalistic texts, and you do all that, and then you're doing a functional analysis or a Chomskyan analysis, well, maybe I don't like one or the other of those as a reviewer. I'm going to pay attention. If I'm doing my job, I'm saying, is this a valid paradigm in linguistics? Do you have your citations? But let's say someone's biased. Well, if that middle piece is solid and anyone can use it, then that is a good part of the application, even if that other piece doesn't do. So I try to encourage people to sort of say, look, this may be my overall framework, but that big piece I'm doing, you know, 75% of the work, actually anyone from any part of the field can pick up.
and do their own thing with, as a way to deal with the fact that there is ideology in linguistics, right? Make it clear my project doesn't rely on ideology.
But the bottom line is, it's your job as the PI to articulate the intellectual merit of the project. And if the intellectual merit is only in one small theoretical framework, how much is that going to really perform well in merit review, regardless of orientation or ideology? So you really want to think about how your proposal and your proposed activities is advancing knowledge in your discipline, and what contribution is it making to advancing our understanding of X.
I actually did this specifically in my proposal, where I brought up two opposing camps and said this is why both of them will find it interesting, actually.
That's great.
Okay, great. So here's another question. It's sort of a two-parter, and the two parts are related. So it's how many, and I guess it's really how few speakers does a language have to have before we begin to consider it as endangered? And the second part of the question is, do you fund native speakers of endangered languages to do research on their language, and should that be made clear in the proposal?
Well, the Documenting Endangered Languages program has funded work on Navajo, which is estimated to have maybe 100,000 speakers, 120,000 speakers. It's probably fewer than that. So what those projects did with those numbers of speakers is articulate why. For things that, for languages that have really, say 75,000 or higher numbers of speakers, that may be a little robust for us, but depending on what the project is, it might be something that we could split the costs of. So, I think it really depends on the situation and context of the specific project, and that's why your proposal should articulate and be responsive to the solicitation specific criteria. If you're looking at degree of endangerment, but also amount and quality of documentation, involvement with the community. You're looking at any particular social, cultural, or religious significance to the language. So if it's a language that's more robust and has this really unique context in which it's used, that could be a real selling point for the proposed activities. So you're doing your best job to articulate why. It's your job as the PI to present the compelling case for why we should fund this. When in doubt about the vitality of the language and whether that makes it eligible for DEL, feel free to email me or whoever the program officer is. And then the second question is, we wouldn't discriminate against a person. I mean, anyone can propose. A native speaker would be able to do some kinds of things that might really be an exciting contribution in terms of, say, semantics or syntax. If the proposal is not producing documentation from a number of different speakers, it's just the PI, I don't think that's going to work for any of the programs that I've mentioned. So but certainly if you were a native speaker of an endangered language applying for a DEL dissertation or any of these programs, that's a great broader impact. And to articulate in the way that Megan talked about for her project, one should do that, because I think that's something that reviewers could be really responsive to. But I don't think a project that would just use if you were the PI and you were a native speaker and it only uses your data and intuitions, I really don't think that's going to be competitive in linguistics, cultural anthropology, or DEL, because it's not reproducible, replicable data.
Okay, thanks. So here's the next question about suggesting reviewers. Can they be affiliated with non-US universities or research institutes, and do they have to have obtained a PhD?
Typically, they should have. Well, there's two kinds of responses to that. So one is we definitely have international reviewers all the time. For example, in some countries in Europe, there's like lots of experts on particular language families. We don't have anyone in the US, maybe, or very few small numbers. I know some programs will, with dissertation grants, may send it to someone who is maybe already gotten a dissertation award, but has still not earned that PhD. But they're advanced enough where their insight would be really valuable. So I know some programs do that. And I know there's also cases where there might be a reason for wanting to send it out to a reviewer who is, say, a community member with some particular expertise that they can bring in. So we had, all kinds of different projects come in. And imagine there's some component, like a citizen science component, for example, that might be the only kinds of people we could find that really have that kind of unique experience are people who are working in the trenches with a community organization and have a bachelor's degree but don't have a master's. So we really do try to have a diverse reviewer pool, to have diverse perspectives, we give a lot of information to reviewers about the merit review process and the criteria. Yeah, so hopefully that answers it.
Okay, great, thanks. The next question. I have a question. Do you negotiate the budget with the PI and the co-PI? For example, let's say the proposal suggested the maximum for the type of project, but the reviewers think the project can be done with less funding.
Yes, that can happen, especially depending on what the costs are.
Do you ever actually increase the budget? I can't remember.
I have increased the budget. So, because sometimes maybe a reviewer says, well, they didn't put any money for archiving, or such and such, I know they're archiving here, but this place would also be a good archiving site. Or, we think they should spend more time in the field. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Megan, did you have any interactions on your budget?
Yeah, with Joan mailing, she wanted, like I said, I wanted money for my undergrad to go with me to conference, and I put it under travel, and she wanted it moved to participant support costs. So
yeah, because it was an undergrad. So yeah, I hadn't heard this approach before, and this is actually kind of a fun broader impact. So you can have a team that you're training to do that, to work with you on your project. And you are building, in your case, building capacity with that young woman. There is a kind of undergraduate research experience for undergraduates component, and those monies would go in undergraduate. Those would go in participant support, and would have that code. So that's great, and that's a nice thing for you to have when you're applying for jobs, because when you get your PhD and you're applying for grants, because you've got this experience having mentored research assistants.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question. Can we briefly review the difference between a project description and project summary? Should we write the project summary with a different audience in mind compared to the full project description?
The project summary is one page, and it's got an overview, and then it lays out what your intellectual merit is and your broader impacts. And that is usually what we send to reviewers when we are asking them to review a proposal, because it gives them a little idea about what the project is. So it's a one-page thing. Your project description is 10 pages outlining in excruciating detail what you will be doing. So the project summary, and the other thing I should add in is, if you're recommended for funding, the abstract that goes on. So Megan had her slide with her award number, and Jeff had award numbers. You can go to fastlane.nsf.gov and look at awards and put their names in there and see their projects. And I will bet you dimes to dollars that what they have as their Fastlane abstract is not what they submitted, because the Fastlane abstract is for a general public audience. Any American citizen or person in Congress can look up and see what we're funding. And the science needs to be articulated for not just the technical community, but for that general audience. And that's not what a project summary does. The project summary is really to give people a sense before they read the project, like an abstract in a journal article. Mm-hmm. But it must have the intellectual merit and the broader impacts. That's an NSF compliance requirement.
Great. So next one says, very specific question. My dissertation involves linguistic analysis of an endangered language, therefore DEL, and part of how I pay my host community is by preparing pedagogical materials. I was told not to include that in the budget because NSF would not fund the development of learning materials not directly related to my research question. Can I still include this as a broader impact?
So I would look at what the cost is, but that's a broader impact. So taking those materials and preparing them for a teaching audience is a broader impact. That's something that another audience will use. It's another use of those materials. You know, if it's the bulk of what you're asking for, then it no longer really seems like a research grant. But revitalization activities are a terrific broader impact in a Dell grant. And people do things where they take what their research is and prepare it for a public audience. Megan, what did you, your middle school activities, how are you taking your research and translating it for that audience?
Yeah, so I work with the after school program, and I took it to them by going through the scientific method with them and using my research as the way to get in there. Yeah. And I also wanted to bring them to campus to come to the lab, but that became more complicated than I thought it was going to be because of busing and stuff. But that was also the idea too. Things to think about when you propose that.
Yeah, so there's definitely lots. I mean, those are thinking about what your broader impacts are. If that's now, what I can also tell you is that a reviewer would probably look at that and want to know, you know, like Megan said, her reviewers were like, oh, she has a track record of working with this middle school. She didn't just pull it out of nowhere and put it in there to put something in there. So if you actually have expertise or have prepared similar materials or what have you, you know, then you would put that in there. In the Dell solicitation, one of the criteria is about community collaborations and trainings, and that kind of activity can be also responsive to the solicitation.
Okay, here's a question for Megan. In what year of your program did you apply? And I guess this applies to both submissions.
Yeah, so I guess I was in the middle of my 4th year the first time I applied and got declined, and then I applied right before my 5th year. So my dissertation year is being funded.
Okay. Here's one interesting one. I have 2 advisors. Can I list both of them as PI? I'm mainly asking this regarding the PI's bio sketch, where I include 5 publications from my PI that pertain to my proposal.
Yeah, so all 3 of you can be on that proposal. There's only one PI, and technically the PI is the first name on the cover page. So your second advisor cannot be also a PI. They would be a co-PI. But PI really is just who's the first name on the cover page.
Okay, here's the next question. Do research projects that are geared towards endangered languages stand higher chances of getting funded than those related to language genesis or other research areas?
So you can look at FastLane and see what is being funded. I know that both linguistics and Dell have projects like on sign language in their portfolio. And I know linguistics has a number of different kinds of projects on the emergence of sign languages, on the emergence of Creole languages. And so there's definitely a lot of different kinds of things in the portfolios.
Well, probably endangered languages projects stand a higher chance just by virtue of the fact that there's a dedicated program for them, right? I mean, who knows we don't know how to adjust those statistics, right? I mean, NSF has set aside money, right, for endangered languages, which, right, so.
Yeah, but all 3 programs have a dedicated part of their budget that's going to support dissertation awards.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So, and those numbers are in the solicitation, and they say, so if you go to each solicitation, it tells you how many awards each year the program anticipates making. I make the fewest, but I get the fewest dissertation submissions. The interesting irony of the anytime dissertation deadline is So chemistry, the chemistry division actually experimented with it getting away from deadlines, and they had fewer submissions. So that also there seems to be this byproduct. People are like, oh, well, I can submit anytime. I don't, and they put it off. Whereas if they actually have a deadline, they get it in. So, so there's definitely a much larger volume of proposals. And I think cultural anthropology, gets the most. But all three programs have dedicated budgets that support graduate dissertation awards, and I think all three of our programs feel very strongly and supportively about this kind of work. The thing is, they're small awards, so a senior award can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a dissertation award, for $20,000, you're able to have this amazing impact on a dissertation, on a student, on the research, on the field. And so it's a lot of bang for your buck. So I think the challenge of the dissertation awards is because spending $200,000 in all dissertation awards versus one $200,000 award, one award is less work than 20 awards of 10,000 each. Each of those 20 awards, the program officer has to send out for review, manage the compliance, look through the reviews, send a panel, set up the panel, and then if it's funded, write the reviews for the declines and write the reviews for the funds, and then work with the PIs to get their abstract together, to get their get any budget revisions, to get IRB approval, country approval. So it's actually like it really does show the sort of commitment on the part of the programs in SBE that have dissertation awards to putting in that human resource for making sure those programs continue, because it is a lot of work. And but I think we all feel very strongly that we're committed to supporting graduate education in that way.
Great. Here's a question for Megan. How long was the process from starting the application for the grant until you submitted it?
The first time I submitted, this will be easier for me to remember since I wrote it from scratch then, I applied to the July 15th deadline. So I believe that I started in about April. And it helps that my advisor is also someone who's very efficient and likes for me to get things done earlier. And she had a successful student DDRIG before, so she knew to make sure to get me going pretty early. But for that way, I started in April, and I think I had a complete draft of everything to her by June 1st. And then she had some revisions, and then we sent it to the internal stuff in early June.
Can I ask just, do you remember, so the July 15th deadline, do you remember what Arizona's do they have a different internal deadline of when they want everything done? For me, it's about a week before, so
yeah,
I have to do that in. Okay.
Yeah. And we got it in 2.5 weeks early, I remember, and they didn't do anything with it until right before, and I was so stressed out.
I thought it was the deadline.
Yeah. But so that was stressful. But they're used to it, I'm sure, getting, so yeah. And give yourself time, because it's harder than you think to write 10 pages. You think, okay, you're starting and it seems like a lot, and it becomes not a lot. You have so much to say. Give yourself time. Yeah.
Okay, I think we probably have time for a couple more questions, and here's another one for Megan. What advice do you have for somebody who has never submitted an NSF grant before?
I would say that I really hope that you have an advisor that is supportive of you, that you can work with, send drafts back and forth. Because if you go in not knowing anything, it's going to be hard to point out the things that are just glaringly wrong. So if your advisor can't do that for you, maybe another grad student in the department or someone else on your dissertation committee can help you with that. Also, like I said, give yourself enough time, because it's stressful enough being a graduate student. It's going to be stressful. Don't put more stress on yourself by trying to do it in June when it's due on July 15th. I've seen my peers do that, and it does not look like it feels good to try to do that. So give yourself time, and remember to spend enough time on the methods. That really was a point that they made clear to me, is that they want to know exactly what you're doing. Don't tell them what everyone else has done before. Like, yes, you have to do a little bit of that, but make sure that you articulate everything that you're doing, and how feasible it is. Make sure that they know that you've thought about this.
Great. Here's a specific question, probably for Colleen. I want to use electroencephalography, EEG, for my dissertation. Can I purchase nets used to record brain responses using DDRIG funds? And after that, who owns the nets?
Well, any equipment that's purchased is owned by the university. So you won't be able to take that with you when you leave if your university doesn't allow you. So I would not think you're adding to your equipment. I don't know how much that is, but if it's the costs of what you need to do research, you can put it in your budget. If you are at an institution where that is accessible and you're not actually explaining why you need this other one, then your reviewers are going to say that. And I mean, we're not able to fund every single thing out there, and so budgets do get cut. So if you put something in there that exists at your institution, your reviewers are going to say, well, her advisor is using this equipment all the time. I don't understand why they can't use that equipment. That's going to come up. So, but if it's something that really you can justify, then you put it in your budget. If you put it in your budget and it puts you over the minimums, that would be a linguistics application, a proposal, and it puts you over 12,000, you're going to have to cut something, because you can't put in a budget more than 12,000 on the direct costs.
Okay, we've got maybe about 5 minutes for this last question, and it's probably a question that merits more than 5 minutes, so I may cut you all off. But and this could apply for all three of you. Is there any advice you can offer from unsuccessful grant applications?
Steph, why don't you start?
Oh, okay. Well, I think that I tried to get this before, but I'll repeat it a bit. So read those reviews carefully. Read the panel summary carefully. I would say, don't assume that just because you had a bunch of excellent reviews that means that, like, don't focus on all that praise. Find the constructive criticism. So just read those. It's very similar if you're going through the process as a student of also learning how to revise a journal article. You have to look at those reviews. I think Megan said something very important, which is, you're going to be defensive. That's normal. You're really this, but what you should really, I think her approach was really productive, which is, like, understand this not as, personal inadequacy or that you're a bad linguist. Understand it as an error of communication. That your project, if it's, it should be a good project. It made it through your committee. You're at a PhD granting institution, and, read those. And even if you're like, well, of course this criticism doesn't, of course that doesn't apply to me. The thing, did I make that clear? So I always say, view it as an error of communication. Try to be clearer next time. So look at those reviews. Obviously, give yourself time. And I know I had at least one other thought there, but it's kind of, I'll come back in. But I think that's, like, I think I really liked what you had said, sort of, Megan. Like, go back, have ice cream, whatever the thing is you need, and go back and realize that, no, my research is sound. It was just the proposal didn't make it clear, because really it's not. They're not judging you personally. They're not really judging, is your research topic important generally. They're sort of judging your proposal, right? That's really what's in the mix there. So think of it as that kind of process. I'll let you guys talk. If I remember that little blip, I'll bring it back.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what Jeff said. I guess maybe some advice from what I've learned, since some of you will be successful the first time. So here, here's advice. Like, you won't have to learn from your mistakes, because you'll get it. I would say, like I had said earlier, I'll just reiterate, think about the questions that someone would ask about your project and answer them. So once you do a draft, you read through it and you're like, oh, you know, I realize now that someone might ask how I'm going to target this population. How am I going to recruit these people? I totally forgot to mention that, or I didn't have enough room. Cut something else and make sure that you know, like, they know exactly how you're going to recruit those people. Like I said, that, you know, these are, if you had that question, it's probably important and you need to find room to put it in there. So make sure that you include everything that explains all these questions that people are going to have. And again, that's why it's good to have other people read it so that they can point out, well, I see that you're going to do this, but I have no idea how you're going to do it. It just, so that's helpful.
I think, Megan, you said something else that has been my experience, and I've seen it sounded like at some point you had a proposal that was longer than 10 pages, right? And then you had to cut it down. That can take a lot of time. But I actually find when you read lots of proposals that you can actually tell someone who really had had everything down, and then they took out the extra stuff they didn't need. But you really get a sense of a much richer project, because it turns out, like, if you just hit the 10-page limit at the deadline and you have some fluff in there, that shows. Whereas if you actually had kind of covered everything and then had to go through and just like really, then you get this really kind of tight proposal and you're like, everything's covered. And the other thing is, you know, if you haven't hit the page limit, or the proposal feels fluffy with extra thing, and a reviewer, you're like, they didn't answer this question, but they could have.
They had space.
They had space. But then you have this other proposal where you're like, my God, what do they do in 10 pages? You know, it's true they didn't answer this question, but you kind of like, well, you know, they only had 10 pages. And so sometimes I think by giving yourself time to write a longer proposal and then cutting that out, you really end up with something that's more competitive than the kind of things we all produce at deadlines, which is always has extraneous stuff that you could have cut out if you just had time.
So one thing I've gotten, I think, really good at being here at NSF, so I'm in my third year here, and I feel like having sat on different panels for lots of different programs, my own panels, and just reading. I mean, you know, here you read so much. I just read so many different reviews and panel summaries and the internal reviews that we write, and read them for other projects. So someone may have gotten rejected when I wasn't here, and I'm trying to give them feedback. So looking at the panel summary, if you have a panel summary, if your project went to panel summary is the most important document that you can look at, and look at what they say your weaknesses were in intellectual merit and broader impacts, and what they say in the concluding paragraph. Because that's telling you what the fatal flaws were. That's one thing. I mean, and I'll also add, I have lots of rejected grant applications to NSF and other places, so I'm no stranger to rejection either. The next piece of advice I would say is, there was something that Megan said, which you know, and I'm not sure if it was when you were talking about that you had actually had this project that volunteering in the middle school, but you know, you can only be who you are, and you have your set of skills, you have your set of experiences, you have your set of knowledge, you have what you're good at, and write to your strengths. Be the most authentic intellectual side of yourself and broader impact side of yourself that you can be, because you won't have stuff to back up. You are not providing, if you try to be a sociolinguist, but you've never taken a sociolinguistics course, but you want to do sociolinguistics in your proposal, your reviewers are, it's just not going to work. There's no evidence backing up that this is a feasible project conducted by someone who has no sociolinguists. So take stock of yourself in an honest way, and what you've got in your background and what you've got like at disposal that might really provide evidence for the reviewers that you have a feasible and potentially successful project. And then the next thing I would say is, there's also stuff beyond your control. And you could have a project that's competitive, because it's the way the projects that go to panel are rated, it's against everything that was submitted in that batch. And you don't know what else is submitted. You don't know what other people are doing. And you just, you know, your project may be competitive, but not competitive enough to get funded. Or it may be a year that there were so many dissertation awards, you know, they couldn't go down that far in the list. So with if you are sent to, your proposal is sent to panel, there is a context statement that tells you how many proposals were looked at in that session and what their rankings were. And so you can see, I think people have a higher success rate on dissertation grants rather than senior grants. Again, because we really do support that. It's big bang for your buck, given the amount of money that's being spent. But we can't fund everything. And the timing cycle can play a role as well. You know, so, right, so if you're talking about a program with 2 deadlines a year, you know, if tons of things come in the fall, you know, but they're not competitive, you could end up being in that batch that's really, really viable. So you just don't know. There's so many things that you can't control. You just have to do the best that you can, given what you are as a scholar and as a person, and what your connections are. And I think that's the best that you can do.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. We're running out of time, but thank you very, very much to our panelists who've taken time out of their busy days to provide their perspectives on the grant application process, and thanks to all of you who attended. And just as a reminder, for any of you who have participated and are new to the LSA, we'd like to provide a membership discount if you would care to join us. The website is www.linguisticsociety.org/join, and you can use the coupon code DDRIG to get a 15% discount on an LSA membership. Also, this webinar has been recorded, and the recording should be ready in a couple of days and uploaded to our YouTube channel. And I will send around an announcement to all of you when that's ready. So again, thanks everyone very, very much for participating, and hope to see you again at another webinar sometime soon.
Thank you, and great job, Megan and Jeff, in sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, David, for all your work.
Thank you, David.
Yes, David.
Bye.